The convoy of trucks rolled through the French countryside in the summer of 1944, and from a distance, they looked like any other American military vehicles moving supplies and equipment. But inside those trucks were not hardened infantry soldiers or combat engineers. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, actors, and set decorators who just weeks earlier had been working in advertising agencies, art schools, theaters, and Hollywood studios. These men carried paintbrushes, inflatable rubber, sound equipment, and rolls of canvas instead of rifles and grenades. Their mission was not to kill German soldiers but to fool them, to create an illusion so convincing that German commanders would make decisions based on false information, sending their troops to defend against armies that did not exist while the real Allied forces attacked elsewhere. This was the Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and it was composed of approximately 1,100 American artists and creative professionals who used inflatable tanks, sound effects, fake radio traffic, and elaborate visual deceptions to trick Hitler and his generals throughout the campaign in Europe following D-Day. Their phantom divisions and imaginary armies tied down German forces, protected real American units, and created confusion that saved thousands of Allied lives. This is the story of how creativity became a weapon, how art became warfare, and how 1,100 men armed with imagination fought one of the most unusual campaigns of World War II. The concept of military deception was nothing new in 1944. Armies had been using camouflage, dummy positions, and misleading movements for centuries. But World War II raised deception to an industrial scale, and nowhere was this more true than in the elaborate efforts to mislead the Germans about Allied intentions. The entire D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious operation in history, was protected by an enormous deception plan called Operation Fortitude. This plan convinced the Germans that the main Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel, rather than at Normandy where it actually occurred. The deception involved fake army groups in southeast England, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, and planted intelligence that reached German ears through double agents. The Germans believed that General George Patton, whom they considered the Allies' best general, was commanding this fictitious army group, preparing to invade at Calais. Even after the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944, German high command believed for crucial weeks that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. They held powerful panzer divisions in reserve to meet this phantom threat, divisions that could have been thrown against the Normandy beachheads and might have pushed the Allies back into the sea. The success of Operation Fortitude demonstrated that deception worked on a strategic level, but as Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches and began the campaign to liberate France and push into Germany, the need for tactical deception became apparent. American and British commanders needed ways to make the Germans think Allied forces were stronger in certain areas than they actually were, or make the Germans think attacks were coming from directions where no attack was planned, or convince German intelligence that American divisions were in one location when they were actually somewhere else entirely. Traditional military units could not perform this kind of elaborate deception while also fighting. What was needed was a specialized unit dedicated entirely to deception, a unit that could create convincing illusions of military strength and then disappear before the Germans realized they had been fooled. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated in January 1944 with this mission. The planners who created this unit understood that effective military deception required creativity, artistic skill, and an understanding of how to manipulate perception. So they did something unprecedented. They recruited artists. The Ghost Army was deliberately filled with men who had backgrounds in art, design, theater, radio, and film. These were not typical soldiers. Many had attended prestigious art schools like the Pratt Institute or the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. Some had worked in advertising on Madison Avenue, creating campaigns to sell products by manipulating consumer perception. Others had been stage designers, creating theatrical illusions. Some had worked in Hollywood creating movie sets. A few were established artists, who had shown their work in galleries. These men brought skills that had nothing to do with firing rifles or digging foxholes, but which would prove invaluable in creating the illusions that would deceive German intelligence. The Ghost Army was organized into several specialized units, each with different roles in creating the deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers were responsible for visual deception, creating dummy tanks, artillery, trucks, and other equipment that would look real from German observation posts or aerial reconnaissance. The 3132nd Signal Service Company Special handled what was called special effects, which meant using recorded sounds to simulate the noise of tanks, trucks, and troops. The Signal Company also created false radio traffic, transmitting the kinds of messages that a real combat division would send, with the proper call signs, codes, and communication patterns that German radio intercept units would recognize. The 406 Combat Engineers supported the operation with actual engineering work when needed. Together, these units could create a complete illusion of a powerful military force, where none existed. The key to the visual deception was inflatable equipment. The Ghost Army had hundreds of inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and even airplanes. These were not cheap toys. They were sophisticated pieces of equipment made from rubber or rubberized fabric, designed and manufactured to look exactly like real military vehicles when inflated and properly positioned. An inflatable Sherman tank, when fully inflated, looked remarkably convincing from a distance or from the air. It was the right size, the right shape, and painted with the correct markings and camouflage patterns. The Germans, observing through binoculars or taking reconnaissance photographs from aircraft, would see what appeared to be a tank battalion preparing for action. They would report this to their intelligence officers, who would mark Allied tank positions on their maps and plan their defenses accordingly. The process of setting up a deception operation was elaborate and required careful planning. The Ghost Army would receive orders to simulate a specific unit, perhaps the 6th Armored Division or the 2nd Infantry Division, in a specific location. They would move into the area, usually at night, to avoid observation, and begin setting up their inflatable equipment. Teams of men would unpack the deflated tanks and artillery pieces, inflate them using air compressors, and position them to look like a real military formation. They would create mock bivouac areas, with tents and vehicles arranged as a real unit would arrange them. They would mark the equipment with the proper unit insignia and tactical markings. They would even create fake vehicle tracks in the mud, using special rollers, because German intelligence would look for such details. Everything had to be perfect, because German reconnaissance was sophisticated, and any detail that seemed wrong could give away the deception. While the visual deception was being set up, the sound effects teams went to work. They had recordings of actual American armored and mechanized units on the move, sounds of tank engines, trucks, troops, construction activity, all the noise that a real military unit would make. These recordings were played through powerful speakers positioned around the area, creating the audible illusion of major military activity. The Germans had listening posts trying to identify Allied unit movements by sound, and the Ghost Army knew how to fool them. If you were a German soldier in a defensive position at night, and you heard the sound of tanks and trucks moving into position across from you, you would report it to your commanders. You would not know that what you heard was a recording played through speakers by men who had worked in radio and sound studios before the war. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element. Every real military unit generated radio traffic, messages between headquarters and subordinate units, logistical communications, routine reports, all transmitted in codes that both sides knew the enemy was intercepting and trying to break. The Germans had extensive radio intercept capabilities and used traffic analysis, studying the patterns and volume of radio traffic to identify unit locations and intentions even when they could not break the codes. The Ghost Army's radio operators would transmit fake traffic, mimicking a real division's communication patterns. They would use the proper call signs for the unit they were impersonating, send messages at the proper times and frequencies, and create a complete radio signature that German intercept units would pick up and interpret as evidence of that unit's presence and activities. The Ghost Army's first major operation, Operation Elephant, occurred in mid-June 1944, shortly after D-Day, and demonstrated both the potential and the challenges of tactical deception. The real 2nd Armored Division was moving from one sector of the Normandy front to another to prepare for an attack. This movement left a gap in the American lines that the Germans could exploit if they realized the 2nd Armored had departed. The Ghost Army was ordered to take the place of the 2nd Armored Division and make the Germans believe the division was still in its original position. The Ghost Army moved into the vacated areas and set up inflatable tanks, created fake radio traffic, and generally simulated the presence of an armored division. The deception worked. German intelligence continued to believe the 2nd Armored was in its original position, allowing the real division to move and prepare for its attack without German interference. Over the following months, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy, swept across France, and approached the German border, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 major deception operations. Each operation was different, tailored to the specific tactical situation and the deception objectives. Sometimes the Ghost Army would simulate a powerful force building up in one area to make the Germans reinforce that sector, pulling troops away from where the real Allied attack would come. Other times they would impersonate a specific division that was actually somewhere else, confusing German intelligence about Allied order of battle and force dispositions. Sometimes they would create the impression of preparations for an attack that was never going to happen, causing the Germans to prepare defenses against a phantom threat. One of the most successful operations, Operation Viersen in March 1945, demonstrated how effective the Ghost Army could be. The real 9th Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the German heartland. The crossing point would be heavily defended, and the Germans would throw everything they had at any attempt to cross. The Ghost Army was ordered to simulate a major buildup near the town of Viersen, about 10 miles south of the actual crossing point. For days, the Ghost Army created the illusion of multiple divisions assembling near Viersen, with inflatable tanks and artillery, recorded sounds of troops and vehicles, and intensive radio traffic suggesting imminent attack. German reconnaissance observed this buildup and reported it. German commanders moved troops and artillery to defend against the expected assault at Viersen. When the real 9th Army actually crossed the Rhine north of Viersen, they faced lighter opposition than expected because German forces had been pulled south to defend against the Ghost Army's phantom attack. The crossing succeeded with lower casualties than anticipated, and thousands of American soldiers who might have died or been wounded facing stronger defenses survived because German troops were defending against tanks made of rubber. The danger to Ghost Army soldiers should not be underestimated. These were not combat troops, but they operated close to the front lines, sometimes ahead of the actual front lines, in positions that would draw German attention and fire. If the Germans discovered the deception, if they realized the tanks were inflatable and the divisions were fake, they might attack the Ghost Army positions, and 1,100 men with minimal combat training and limited weapons would be overrun. The Ghost Army lost men during their operations, killed by German artillery or patrols. Setting up inflatable tanks in an open field within range of German observation positions was legitimately dangerous work. The men were exposed while working, and if German artillery opened up on their positions, they had to take cover in the same foxholes and ditches that real combat troops used. The soldiers of the Ghost Army also had to maintain the deception through personal behavior. When they moved into an area to impersonate a specific division, they wore that division's shoulder patches and unit insignia. They drove vehicles with that division's markings. When they went into local towns or interacted with French civilians, they had to stay in character, claiming to be part of the real division they were impersonating. This was necessary because German intelligence gathered information from many sources, including French civilians who might be interrogated or who might be German spies. If word got out that the 6th Armored Division soldiers in a particular town were actually artists and designers creating fake equipment, the entire deception would collapse. So Ghost Army soldiers became actors playing the role of combat soldiers, maintaining their cover at all times. The artistic work some Ghost Army soldiers did during the war is remarkable. Between deception operations during quiet periods, many of the artists in the unit continued to sketch and paint, documenting their experiences and the war around them. These were trained artists with genuine talent, and their artwork from the war is now in museums and collections. Some of this art depicted the surreal scenes they were part of, fields full of inflatable tanks, the strange juxtaposition of artistic creation and military necessity. Other pieces documented the destruction they saw as they moved through France, Belgium, and Germany, the ruined cities and displaced civilians. After the war, several Ghost Army veterans went on to notable careers in art and design. Bill Blass became a famous fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most important abstract artists. Art Kane became a renowned photographer. These men used the creative skills they brought to the Ghost Army to build successful post-war careers, but they rarely talked about what they had done during the war because the Ghost Army's operations were classified. The secrecy surrounding the Ghost Army lasted for decades. While the war ended in 1945, the techniques and methods the Ghost Army used remained militarily useful, and the government classified the unit's activities. The men who served in the Ghost Army were sworn to secrecy and told not to discuss their work. For nearly 50 years, the Ghost Army remained largely unknown outside of military intelligence circles. The veterans could not tell their families what they had really done during the war. They could not write memoirs or give interviews. The ingenious deceptions, the creative applications of art to warfare, the successful operations that had saved lives, all of it remained secret. It was not until the 1990s that documents were declassified and the full story of the Ghost Army began to emerge. Veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, could finally talk about their experiences. Books were written, documentaries were made, and the Ghost Army received the recognition it deserved. The question of how 1,100 American artists saved thousands of lives during D-Day and the subsequent European campaign has multiple layers of answer. Directly, they saved lives by creating deceptions that caused German forces to deploy incorrectly, to defend against attacks that never came, to hold reserves in position against phantom threats while real Allied forces attacked elsewhere. Every time a German division was held in reserve, because of Ghost Army deception, Allied soldiers attacking in a different sector faced lighter opposition. Every time German artillery was positioned to fire on inflatable tanks, that artillery was not firing on real American troops. Every time German commanders made decisions based on false intelligence created by the Ghost Army, those decisions potentially saved Allied lives. More broadly, the Ghost Army contributed to the overall Allied deception efforts that protected major operations. The D-Day invasion succeeded in part because of strategic deceptions like Operation Fortitude, but it also succeeded because tactical deceptions throughout the campaign kept the Germans confused about Allied strength, positions, and intentions. The Ghost Army was one element in a larger system of deception that gave the Allies consistent advantages. The Germans never fully understood where Allied forces were concentrated or where attacks would come. This uncertainty made it difficult for German commanders to make optimal decisions about deploying their forces, and that uncertainty was partly created by the Ghost Army's operations. The Ghost Army also demonstrated something important about warfare and human conflict. Military power is not just about physical force, about tanks and artillery and infantry. It is also about information, perception, and psychology. If you can make your enemy believe you are strong where you are weak and weak where you are strong, you can win battles without fighting them, or at least fight them on more favorable terms. The Ghost Army weaponized creativity and artistic skill, turning talents normally used to sell products or create entertainment into tools for saving lives in war. The artists who served in the Ghost Army used the same skills they had used in peacetime. Skills of visual design, sound engineering, theatrical illusion, and storytelling, but applied those skills to military purposes. In doing so, they proved that diverse talents have value in warfare, that creative thinking can be as important as combat training, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a gun, but an idea. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond World War II. The techniques they pioneered, the integration of multimedia deception using visual, audio, and electronic elements, influenced military deception doctrine for decades. Modern military forces still use deception extensively, though the tools have evolved. Today's military deceptions might use computer-generated false radar signatures, cyber operations, to plant false information in enemy networks, or sophisticated camouflage technologies. But the principles are the same as those the Ghost Army used. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, hear what you want them to hear, believe what you want them to believe. The Ghost Army proved these principles worked, and their success validated deception as a force multiplier that relatively small units could employ to achieve effects far beyond their size. For the 1,100 men who served in the Ghost Army, their war was unique and surreal. They were soldiers but not combat soldiers. They were artists, but creating works of military necessity rather than aesthetic beauty. They saved lives through deception, rather than valor in combat. They experienced the danger and horror of war, living in the same conditions as combat troops, sometimes under fire, watching Europe's liberation and destruction. But their contribution was subtle and hidden, rather than obvious and celebrated. They could not talk about it for 50 years, could not share with family and friends the creative and dangerous work they had done. When the story finally became public, many of the veterans were elderly or had already passed away, but for those who lived to see the Ghost Army's story told, there was satisfaction in finally being able to explain what they had done, to have their contribution recognized, to know that history would remember how American artists went to war, armed with paintbrushes and imagination, and helped win the greatest conflict in human history. The Ghost Army saved thousands of lives, because deception works, because creative solutions to military problems can be as effective as firepower, and because 1,100 men were willing to use their artistic talents in service of a cause larger than themselves. They tricked Hitler, fooled his generals, confused his intelligence services, and protected Allied operations through pure creative genius. They proved that in war, as in art, perception is reality, and whoever controls perception controls the narrative. The inflatable tanks are now museum pieces. And here of whatever controls perception controls the narrative. The inflatable tanks are now museum pieces. They proved that in war as in art, perception is reality. And whoever controls perception controls the narrative. The inflatable tanks and Captain 5 Trammels. The sound recordings are historical artifacts. The radio deceptions are case studies in military textbooks. But the lives saved by those deceptions are real. The soldiers who came home because German bullets were aimed at rubber tanks instead of real ones. The families who were not destroyed because their fathers and sons and brothers faced lighter opposition, thanks to Ghost Army operations. That is why 1,100 American artists could save thousands during World War II, and that is why their story, finally told after decades of secrecy, remains one of the most fascinating and inspiring chapters of the war.